Okay, so I listened to the video. I knew right away this guy was an anarchist. Now, I don't want to start out by poisoning the well here or anything like that, but anarchists have a certain, actually, you probably know this, their worldview on humanity is almost identical to communists in that they believe humanity starts out flowers and bunnies and roses, and everybody has enough for everybody, and all of our needs are taken care of. And only from people taking the resources in excess do we find ourselves in short supply, where people have to do desperate things. This is not the reality of life. And how do I justify that perception? Well, look at the animal kingdom. If you want to go close to the species, any of the monkeys, any of the apes. What do they do in their tribes? That's what they call them, just like us. They go up into, they take a tree, and it has food in it. That's why they want to live in a tree, because food grows on the tree, and they don't have to leave the tree any more than it's absolutely necessary, except to get water. They kill any ape or group of apes that tries to approach that tree, or whatever they live in, depending on the species. If the other apes manage to overpower them, they kill the other apes. There's not a member of the animal species that does things roughly that every member of the animal species does things roughly the same way, unless you're a flight and not a fight species, like a horse. Even still, so the anarchists do this backwards. They believe, I'm saying it's backwards, and I'm revealing my own prejudices, but I used to believe what this guy does. I was never an anarchist. I was a communist. But it's the same thing when it comes to this worldview. It's not connected to reality. You only have to look at not just early human civilization, but you also have to look at every other species on this planet. But now that I've said my opinion on that and why, and I can get into that at another time at more length, let's see what David Graeber has to say. We know that he's talking about economics. He's talking about the distinction between slavery and renting yourself out and such. So that there is little to no distinction according to him. And again, I used to believe this. And I'm going to just say it on the front end. I'm going to challenge this.
Throughout most of human history, the sort of nightmare scenario of total social breakdown that people envisioned was precisely the debt trap.
I think what he means here is that the nightmare that people try to avoid is the debt trap. And I think he's talking about for individuals. And I don't know that that's necessarily true, but it's a good nightmare to fear. So the idea is, that's what, but by the way, it's got nothing to do with the decline of a civilization. Debt traps for individuals have existed as long as debt has existed. And before there was debt, there was, you ran out of food. I hope you have a family that'll look after you, because if you don't, you're fucked. Then there came concepts of debts where, okay, or what he's about to bring up later, things like indentured servitude and slavery. And we will see what he's about to say.
Essentially that 1 or 2% of the population would end up with all the resources, end up lending it to everybody else, and people would start falling so deeply into debt they'd have to sell members of their family, their children would be pawned, they'd end up having to work for households of strangers. Eventually people might even have to sell themselves to work for others into slavery.
It's always 1 or 2%. It's the far, I don't want to sound like I'm partisan, but I am. The far left is obsessed with these two numbers when they're talking about the bad guy. There is absolutely no justification for 1 or 2% when you're talking about anything historical, when you're getting into the infancy of human civilization, even the midpoint of human civilization, because there's no way to justify that kind of a number. They didn't have Gallup polls and Bureau of Statistics in ancient Sumer. Now, I will say slavery has existed as long as human civilization has. We don't even know how it started. We can make assumptions. I have assumptions. They're logical assumptions. But it's always existed. It's likely that you didn't start out slavery with your own. It's likely that in early civilization, slavery was something you did because you just won a war and you took captives from the other country because fuck you, we used up all of our resources fighting your ass so you wouldn't take over. Back then, you could be sure if you were at war, you were either an aggressor or an aggressed. By the time the early Bronze Age came around, that was life, and you had to. And if you did, it's like Machiavelli. If you did not play into that system, you would become a victim of that system. And anybody that thinks that they can go back in time and be a chieftain of a tribe, and they're going to be, I'm going to do away with slavery. Thanks, you just destroyed your entire society. You're all dead. Or maybe you could function potentially, depending on where you were, without slavery, hypothetically, but you would not survive if you decided you were not going to have war. You're dead. You're dead. Your children are dead. Your people are dead. You're all dead. That's a fact. Because humans don't naturally particularly care one way or the other when it comes to people who they don't see every day. And when you know that that is also true of them, and it is, by the way. If we didn't have philosophers making us rethink that perspective, which I granted is great, we should not be indifferent to the sufferings of outsiders, but never at the expense of our own. Never at the expense of your own family, etc. Never the people that you have responsibility towards first. And there is a hierarchy of responsibility in everyone's life. I don't care if you're a communist, a socialist, a postmodernist, a Rousseauian type. I don't care what's written in the books that one considers sacred. There is an innate hierarchy of responsibility that everybody has to contend with in their life. It's just that simple.
The point I always make is that, if Aristotle were somehow put in a time machine and magically transported to here, he would probably think that the distinction between selling yourself to work for strangers and renting yourself to work for strangers was kind of a legalistic distinction. He would look at Americans and say, these people are debt slaves. I think the great social crisis that everybody is terrified of for much of human history has happened to us. And we've made up this language where what people used to think of as slavery is now called freedom. But, has this...
Aristotle, if he was whisked into 21st century America, after he got done saying, wow, you made it a crime to bugger a little boy. That's progress. I never thought I'd live to see the day. Good for you guys. And after he got done doing that, he would never compare this with slavery. Neither would any other person who philosophized about the topic of slavery in his time say guys having to go to work every day or they don't pay whatever services they pay for to sustain themselves are slaves. And the reason for this is very simple with just a little bit of thought. And this was one of those things that nagged at me when I was saying this garbage many, many years ago. Sorry to show my prejudices here, but when you once said something and now you know how bad it is, you tend to be very critical of it. So there's important things about this. Okay, so you think, for a minute, just basic stuff here. Let's talk about what slavery is. I own somebody. They are my property. They rarely did societies give them even basic rights. So until Babylon, Jews actually had rights for slaves too. They are very criticized today, understandably. However, around the time of the Babylonian Empire, as far as I know, the Egyptians might have had a few loose rights. They were the first society, to my knowledge, where a master was, if he wanted to just kill his slave for whatever reason, he answered to nobody. It's his property. You could rape your slaves. They belong to you. It was only around the year, I'm going to say something like 800 years before the Common Era, that a master had certain things he couldn't do to his slaves. The same reason how you own a dog now, or a horse. And there's certain things you are not legally allowed to do for matters of cruelty. Most of history, you didn't even have that. Now, here's what a slave never had the right to do. Never had the right to do. You didn't like your master, you leave. Find another master. No. No, that would make him cease to be a slave. He has autonomy. He can leave. The other thing is, a slave did not, even an indentured servant, did not work on the pretense that I get to just do this until I'm tired of doing it. You are free to leave. Now, I already know what you're thinking, because I already know what I used to say. And what I used to say, well, yeah, but where are you going to go? I mean, you got to have a place to live, right? And you got to have, okay, so you stop working and you stop paying your bills, and well, then they punish you by homelessness, and you don't have food, and well, and no one's really punishing you for that. Food is a resource that has to be produced by somebody who owns the resources to produce it. However, there are people on this earth, and by the way, all 8 million of us cannot do this. It's not sustainable, and it never will be. But there are people who say, fuck this, and they go out into the wilderness. Sometimes they buy a plot of land. There are people who do this as nomads on, government land and stuff, which is illegal, but there's people doing it. We've all seen the YouTube videos of the people that proudly do this, and most of them do it for a few years and then come back. And that is living like a caveman. You can do it still. Nobody wants to. Nobody wants to. We can say that we want to if this wasn't that and it wasn't. But the fact of the matter is, what did prehistoric, not even prehistoric, early historic men, even in the infancy of civilization, you go into ancient Akkad, ancient Sumer, ancient Mongol, I don't care, all the same. You died, if you were lucky, before 40. You had about 8 to 12 children, and at least 4 are going to die. Many people died from their teeth. You know what it's like to die of your teeth? You ever had to have a tooth pulled or drilled? Imagine you couldn't do that. All you could do was wait for the festering to rot around the nerves slowly as before the infection, that you don't even know it's an infection. We didn't know anything about it. As far as we knew, an evil spirit got in my mouth. People used to believe shit like that. Life was short. Life was hard. Life had a lot of death before you yourself joined the club. Very often you would have people who would start producing more than they needed, probably because some marauding, faction, army or pack of whatever raided your village or community, whatever you lived in, and you had 2 wives and 27 kids, and now you have no wives and 4 kids. And, well, I got all this means of production and a lot of actual produce. I can't eat this shit with my 4 kids myself. What do I do? Well, yeah, you're probably going to be charitable to the people that have been charitable to you. And maybe a few people just for the hell of it. You're not going to give it to the whole fucking world. It's just, you're not going to do that. You shouldn't do that. Anything you can save for the winter or summer, depending on where you live, should do. But what about the rest of this? Well, you got to find somebody else to till the land. You got to find. Now, there's a couple of ways you can do this. If it was depending on the nature of the war, you can take slaves from the people that you captured. And this is what you did back then. Because if you fell behind economically, and by that I mean have enough to sustain your people for the inevitable of a bad winter or whatever, then you had to, So what happens in this situation? You start hiring people, usually. If you don't turn them into slaves, you hire them. These are absolutely different. They're not the same thing. A hired hand has a house that he pays for or rents. He has, in our modern world, we got electricity, we got water. Someone says, well, No one's entitled to own that. Okay, well, who's entitled to the means to get it into your sink at home? Who's entitled to the air conditioning in the house? Who's entitled to the house? Just because it's there and someone can use it doesn't mean that someone has a right to it. Now, that I know David Graeber disagrees with me on this. But think about the logical conclusion for that. Because communists and anarchists, there's a reason they all march together at every protest, right next to each other, at every protest for every cause, ever. It's because they believe that no matter what you produce, no matter how much of it was done with your own hands, they decide how much you need, and they decide what constitutes need, and they decide where it goes. Well, it sounds good, everyone sharing with everyone, right? Well, it doesn't work that way. Because, first of all, they don't know what you need. You do. You have your own definition of what need is. And plus, you put your time and blood and sweat into that, so you didn't have to die at 32. So you could actually find some medicine man that can do something with this tooth before the rot and infection kills you. Human life by default is shit by our standard today. And anyone that tells you that we're all noble savages that just shared with each other and we had no needs and life was the Garden of Eden before corporations, man. It was corporations that ruined everything, man. And they made us, and it ruined us and turned us all greedy. No, we were all greedy, as all the apes are greedy, and all the mammals are greedy. They are, and we are. And what happens is, you get an oversight in there to decide how much you need. It ends up being a pack of people who take what is yours so that they can have more than they need. It happens every time. It happened in my own family that I married into now, where they did just that. And yes, I know it's cliche to bring up the Soviet Union, but I'm doing it anyway because anarchists are not different. Chairman Mao started out as an anarchist. All right, think about that. When you are an anarchist and you acquire the power to carry out your anarchist dream, you immediately become a communist or a fascist. You can't, because it can't be. You cannot create the dream of anarchy because it doesn't exist in the human psyche. Because you can't control other people and what they do. And honestly, would you want to? I mean, think about. I don't want to get into the Borg-like scenario that we would be if you could control the wants, needs, and desires and drives of every person. But I'm just going to talk about now the logical conclusion. This worldview is what brought the Soviet Union to the position where they took my wife's family's factory and forced them to work in it, by the way. They were slaves, whether you want to use that word or not. Why were they slaves? And people who work for a wage in the West or anywhere else even. I don't have a lot of good things to say about Russia right now, but even there, their workers are not slaves because, well, they took our factory, forced them to work in it, and because they believed that they weren't entitled to what they labored. And they always said, oh man, no, they don't labor for it, man, other people do it. No, there is a point before your business gets off the ground, before you start. The work that goes, and even getting a small non-brick and mortar business going, is a lot of your time. And when you start hiring people, do you think that you're spending the rest of your time in the Bahamas with a pina colada and a couple of girls in bikinis surrounding you the rest of your life? Fuck no! I couldn't make it in business because I got burned out getting a business off the ground without any investors. Okay, and twice. So it's a lot to keep up with. So that's work. It's tiring, and it'll shorten your life too. But won't shorten your life if you look at the humanity on a grand scheme, as I said before. Okay, so that's the thing. You have to understand that the only way to justify the idea that somebody has resources and you'll go and rent your time out to them so that you can have some resources or money to buy resources from somebody else, which we have, which is a better system. It's not perfect, but it's not perfect, but these guys don't have an alternative. I'm sorry, they don't. Not one that's workable. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we all just shared each other? Okay, how are you going to make that happen? That's where they fall flat. You can't make it happen, not without force. And once you apply force to that, you are now you are a slave master at that point. Because not only do you decide who owns what, or nobody owns what, but you decide who has what. That's a slave. Because you have to have those things to live that they decide whether you get or not. And they have the power to take it away. That's a slave. If you're a wage slave, as Marx called it, pus sore that he is on the Jewish people, wish we didn't have to claim him, but we do. Okay, probably not the worst person in the world. His writings, his idiotic writings became... Well, I'm not even going to call him idiotic. There's a lot we didn't know about humanity then. I'll even give him that. Okay, forget about my opinion of Marx. My point is that when they finally executed this, they are found that people don't... Any philosophy, any worldview, I don't care what it is, that says, if people would just blank, is not a philosophy, is not a theory. It's if they would. You're starting out without an answer to how they will, because they won't. We have too much, not just human civilization to account for, but human nature and our own lives that we live to know that humanity is not like this and can't be made to be like this. A wage slave, as Marx said, has the right to say, I don't like this fucking boss. Take this job and shove it up your ass. I'll take a chance at not being able to pay my rent. That house that you are not entitled to because somebody else worked to build it, unless you own it. Now, you want to get into things like the fact that you could be argued that you don't actually own your house. That is definitely a conversation I'm open to, because at least in terms of America, it is kind of bullshit. You do in a way, but you own it the way you own a Bitcoin if you buy it on fucking Venmo. You can't do whatever you want. The moderator decides. Okay, grant it. But in terms of if you're a renter, nature doesn't give a shit about us as individuals. Nature doesn't give, and we can't fill that void for nature. She did not intend for us to live as old as I am at all, and my body reminds me of it every fucking day. Nature intended us to run around, graze the field. Anarcho-primitivists, they're the closest to reality. That's it. But if you want to get into slavery, Aristotle absolutely would have never called this slavery. He would have made a distinction because you can leave. You can find some other way. You can find somebody else to give you a place to live. Because all these are options. Nature does not provide the options that anarchists like to think are a natural supply if we all wouldn't just be greedy. It doesn't. It lets us die just like the animals die randomly for lack of anything. Medicine, forget about it. That's as human of an invention as you can get to circumvent over nature. Nobody is. Whenever people start with that, when we circumvent nature by getting people to help us, we give something to that person. And a person that doesn't have much has nothing to give but their time or risk. Like, you might decide to work for a drug lord and carry some drugs over a border because you're going to take a chance that he doesn't have to now. But even that, because you have less and the risk is all you have. I'm not suggesting you do that at all. Okay, but this is not slavery. No, not by Aristotle or anything.